and welcome to the eighth lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century women's novels. I ended the previous lecture with a detailed description of the first chapter of Passing by Nella Larsen. I emphasized quite a bit the letter that Irene Redfield receives from Claire Kendry and the very powerful reaction that Claire's accusation produces on Irene. Now, I want to think a little bit about the power of that accusation, the kind of person who might feel entitled or empowered to make those accusations in the first place, what that tells us about the cultural history of African American identity, and in particular, what that tells us about the intersection of race and gender. To recall briefly, it's a very powerful accusation. It uses the language of identity very powerfully. It's an accusation that has a very clear idea of the evolving self. To read again from that language, it begins with, I am lonely, so lonely. It uses the word lonely and longing multiple times. I long to be with you. I've never longed for anything else. So it's full of this me, me, me. It's a very self indulgent, almost navel gazing sort of language. And then eventually it also shifts. It shifts from this description of a mistake that the self has made, from a regret and a realization that the self has made, to an understanding of an interpersonal dynamic that the speaking self shares with another person. So it ultimately becomes a very tragic statement because the speaking self realizes that there's no escape out of this problem other than further entanglement with other selves who are equally entangled in, and I'm getting ahead of myself because the novel has not announced at this point that both these selves are entangled in matters of race and gender. But ultimately, this letter and the reaction it has on Irene pulls both the speaking self and the addressee into the same tragic web of connections. And the first thing to note is what empowers the speaking self, that is Claire Kendry, to use this kind of a language. Now, the first thing to note is that this is the kind of language that was used by certain speakers in the fiction of the time, but it was not often used by speakers who were women or who were women from the black middle class. It was the kind of language that was used by a very particular kind of woman. This was the black woman who was described as stereotypically having a sort of uncontrollable sexual urge in the writing of several African American writers in the early 1920s. So, this is one trope, this is one stereotypical figure that Nella Larsen is taking on. Exactly how it will be treated is not clear, but we can safely say that this figure will be redeemed and it will be humanized beyond the ways that it was represented in the work of many contemporary writers. This was also a language of the self that was available to male speakers in much literature of the time. One example is James Weldon Johnson's autobiography of an ex-colored man, who often speaks of himself in much the same way that Claire Kendry's letter, as read by Irene, does, which is, I did this, I was free enough to do this. And just as former slaves or ex-colored man in James Weldon Johnson's autobiography talks about the different experiences he had once he was treated or he was seen not simply as a racialized subject, but once he was seen simply as a man. So, in James Weldon Johnson's narrative, the freedom that the speaking self enjoys comes from suddenly not being seen as a racial subject. And so some of that freedom, some of that post-racial freedom, one can use that language, is appropriated here by Claire Kendry. So Claire Kendry is not simply passing as a white woman, but she is in fact becoming an individual in her own right. So this is one thing we can get from these words, from the way the speaking self is mobilized and the kind of authority and power that the speaking self has, and the power with which the speaking self makes this accusation that I did this, and I made these mistakes, but I would never have realized these mistakes if I hadn't met you. So there is an admission of guilt, but even more powerful than the admission of guilt is this acceptance of an intertwined or an entangled nature of a shared communal existence. This is a communal existence which is actually quite isolated from the larger community. So this is a self that is looking for communion, but it is looking for communion in an extremely isolated manner. Both Claire and Irene are quite isolated, and it's this isolation that brings them together. It becomes the grounds for a very strange kind of solidarity. They're both closeted in different ways, and it is that coming together of two closeted individuals that ignites a very powerful attraction. And we know that while Claire is the only one who's expressing it, Irene is by no means immune to it. And the last sentence of this chapter describes the way Irene remembers the moment that Claire is referring to and unleashes or frames the rest of the novel. That time in Chicago, this is a phrase that Claire Kendry uses in the phrase, this wild desire, if I hadn't seen you that time in Chicago. So there's a wild desire that seems to have been unleashed almost as a consequence of two things. The desire that Claire writes about is unleashed first from knowing that she will probably live with regret, that she will grow old and live to regret the decision that she has made. That's one part of it. And the second is the regret deepens through her friendship and intimacy with Claire. And it's the inability of expressing both and the differently configured necessities of keeping both these two aspects of her identity secret that seems to combine and produce what Claire calls a wild desire. This paragraph, this moment, is very important for almost every scholar who has read Passing through the lens of a queer perspective, and most powerfully, Deborah McDowell's introduction to the Rutgers University edition of Passing, which I mentioned in my first lecture, does have a brilliant interpretation of this scene. And this moment cannot but support understandings and interpretations that racial passing, while used as the most obvious and important topic in this book, must be used as an instrument or as a device in order to pass something else off as equally important, but perhaps not as easy to discuss. And that might be the growing relationship or the difficulty of accepting the relationships like the one between Claire and Irene. So, how does Irene react to this, and how does Irene frame the rest, or the next chapter at least, which is presented entirely as a recollection from Irene's perspective? That time in Chicago, the words stood out from among the many paragraphs of other words, bringing with them a clear, sharp remembrance in which, even now, after 2 years, humiliation, resentment, and rage were mingled. So, this gives us a very powerful clue as to how we are supposed to read the next chapter, which will be a memory, a reconstruction from Irene's memory of an encounter in Chicago between these two individuals. What is the purpose of that memory? Is Irene trying to get over something? What exactly motivates Irene to produce these recollections? We are told that in that remembrance, three things are mingled, three feelings. There's humiliation, there's resentment, and rage. The first thing to note is that while Claire's letter ended with the phrase wild desire, Irene's recollection, which is triggered by that letter, doesn't mention desire at all. In fact, it mentions different things: humiliation, resentment, and rage. And that tells us a lot about the dynamic between these two individuals and the tension that exists at the heart of this novel, and the tragedy also, which this novel culminates in. That there were some really hard ceilings in the society of its time. And the novel is a hopeful but ultimately tragic exploration of how and to what extent two individuals are willing to oppose or challenge those hard ceilings. Now, the next chapter is a somewhat long one, and it's worth reflecting on, and it's worth pausing to note the different highs and lows and the different turning points in this chapter, because it really helps establish the action that this novel will focus on. So, what happens in this chapter is that Irene is traveling, she's in Chicago, she is enjoying many of the comforts that Black people had begun to enjoy in the early 20th century. The decade in which Larsen was born, the 1890s, were a particularly low point in the trajectory of the African American community, because despite several legal changes, that is, specifically the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution, which made chattel slavery illegal, while these things happened, at the same time, Jim Crow also became a reality. And Larsen's family was also very unique, but also similar to the stories of real individuals who passed, about whom I discussed in the previous lecture, because Larsen was the only dark colored child in a family where everyone else was able to pass. And so Larsen witnessed both the positives and the negatives, both the potential as well as the tragedy of the newly ascendant Black middle class. And in the way the second chapter describes Irene's itinerary through downtown Chicago in the first part of chapter 2, tells us very clearly that Irene was a beneficiary of this kind of material comfort that the newly ascendant Black middle class had begun to avail itself of. She is shopping and she's looking for things to buy for her sons, and she's quite annoyed by the heat, and she's quite annoyed by how the heat and the crowd is making life generally uncomfortable. Everyone is sweating, and there's this phrase that edges her way out of the increasing crowd, feeling disagreeably damp and sticky and soiled from contact with so many sweating bodies. And she hails a cab and she asks the cab driver to take her to a rooftop restaurant where she can relax, have a drink, have some food, and make the most of this hot summer day while she's performing the labor of shopping for things for her family. So she goes to the restaurant called the Drayton, recommended by the cab driver, and it is there that she has a very strange encounter. She sits on this rooftop restaurant, looks at the river, and has an experience which can be found replicated or described in a slightly different way in many novels of this time. And in fact, in this description of Irene Redfield sitting on at a table in this rooftop restaurant in downtown Chicago and reflecting on the many comforts as well as the not unreal discomforts of modern life, one can see the influence of much avant garde modernist writing. Those of you who've read Virginia Woolf will easily recognize the influence of Virginia Woolf, and one can easily recognize a version of Clarissa Dalloway in Irene Redfield, although they are very, very different people. But the voice, the persona, the tone, and the narrator's description of how the amenities of modern life, the technology, the financial well being, the resources, the infrastructure that modernity provides, and once these things become available to women, which were not always available to women, but once they do become available to women characters, they open up a unique space which is full of opportunity, but also has a lot of room for critique and reflection. So, in a way, it's a philosophical meditation on the opportunities that modernity provides to individuals. It's full of opportunity, but also full of contradictions. And in the philosophical treatment of the comforts of modernity, one can see the influence of several avant garde modernist writers on Nella Larsen. And in fact, biographers have noted how Larsen was a very avid reader. And even at the height of the Ulysses controversy, when James Joyce's Ulysses was declared as pornographic and was difficult to access, she spent considerable effort trying to get a friend to bring her a copy of Ulysses from France, I think. So these influences are very strongly felt. But there's something that complicates a straightforward modernist reflection, and this interruption happens when Irene notices a couple walk very close to her table and sit down right next to her. Her first reaction is one of disappointment because it would ruin the solitude that she was enjoying. She was very happy to sit at the table alone and look down at the river from this rooftop table. And the fact that another person or persons might be sitting next to her is very annoying to her. This changes very soon and, in fact, becomes a little more complicated because Irene begins to notice that the person who has sat down next to her is actually a very attractive looking woman. All of this is presented in free indirect discourse, and we also know that this is Irene's reconstruction from memory. But nonetheless, these words are important. Attractive looking is important because it will have a consequence on the kind of dynamic that these two individuals will grow to develop. So, the first thing that Irene notices about this woman who has sat next to her is this: an attractive looking woman, was Irene's opinion, with those dark, almost black eyes and that wide mouth like a scarlet flower against the ivory of her skin. Nice clothes too, just right for the weather, thin and cool without being mussy. Summer things were so apt to be. Now, the first thing that Irene notices about this woman who has sat next to her is that she smiles at the waiter who comes to take her order. And the way in which this woman smiles at the waiter, Irene notices something not quite right in that way. And this is how Irene describes it. It was an odd sort of smile. Irene couldn't quite define it, but she was sure that she would have classed it coming from another woman as being just a shade too provocative for a waiter. So, a shade too provocative for a waiter, meaning Irene has very clear rules on how much or in what way a woman should smile when interacting with a waiter at a restaurant. And there was something in the way this woman smiled at the waiter that Irene is thrown off a little bit. She feels that if someone else had done this, it might have been a bit too much. That is, it would be improper, that it would not be right, and it would maybe provoke a harsh judgment from Irene. But in the way that this woman smiles, it stops short of being inappropriate. It verges on being inappropriate, but is not quite. And this sentiment is repeated a little bit later when the two women actually sit down and discuss and they order. And the same waiter comes again. And at this time, when Irene is sitting with this woman on the same table and is able to get a better look at her, she decides for certain that it was, in fact, too provocative for a waiter. So, why is Irene noticing these things and why is it important? It tells a lot about the kind of person Irene is and the kind of difference between these two individuals and how that difference will exert a great deal of influence on how they relate to each other. But immediately after this, what happens is Irene is struck by a very strange and powerful stare. This woman who has sat down next to her begins to stare at Irene continuously, non-stop, and with a very powerful gaze. And she begins to stare at Irene for so long that Irene becomes a bit uncomfortable and begins to wonder why exactly she's doing so. And the first fear or the first concern that Irene has is that maybe this woman has figured out somehow that Irene is not white. And this is how Irene describes it. Could that woman somehow know that here before her very eyes, on the roof of the Drayton, sat a Negro? And then Irene goes on, absurd, impossible. White people were so stupid about such things for all that they usually asserted that they were able to tell. And by the most ridiculous means, fingernails, palms of hands, shapes of ears, teeth, and other equally silly rot. They always took her for an Italian, a Spaniard, a Mexican, or a gypsy. Never, when she was alone, had they even remotely seemed to suspect that she was a Negro. No, the woman sitting there staring at her couldn't possibly know. So, this is a very telling set of thoughts for several reasons. So, the first thing is it tells us on a very informational level, it gives us a very important information, which is that Irene is one of those individuals who was passing. That is, in this instance, she is passing. She is concerned because if someone were to identify her as black, she would be asked to leave the restaurant. And so the first fear she has when someone stares at her is what if she's found out? But then immediately the confidence with which she passes asserts itself and also provides her with the source of that confidence. She's confident because passing itself is based on an extremely vague definition of what counts as race or how race is defined. For Irene, these white people's definitions of what counts as race often relies on things as hazy and vague as how certain things appear, such as the shapes of one's eyes, noses, shapes of ears, teeth, palms of hands, etc., etc. And Irene quite justifiably dismisses all of these notions as a silly rot. So Irene has a momentary fear, but then she dismisses that and remains concerned because if the identification of her lineage is not the reason for the stare, then there might be something that's even more dangerous, even more complicated, or at least the concern still remains. And so, despite not being caught or despite not being identified as black, this woman keeps staring at her. And after some point, this woman walks up to her and acknowledges her by name and greets Irene by name and tells her that it's been a very long time and does she still go by Irene or has she permanently changed her name to Irene? This produces a moment of shock for Irene because she's not able to identify exactly who this person is and is deeply embarrassed because she tries to reciprocate this kindness and she senses that these two individuals know each other going back a long time. But despite all her efforts, she's not able to figure out who this person is. And the process of that search for identity is very telling because Irene keeps thinking of all the white women that she's met or that she might have encountered somewhere and whose names she might have forgotten. But it's later when this other woman laughs, and it's in her laughter that Irene hears something. And the moment Irene hears her laughter, she immediately bursts out with her name, that is Claire. And then she says, Claire, not really Claire Kendry. And this produces another wave of somewhat guilty realizations, more memories, but more than memories, the guilt at maybe not having acted in better ways. So, the memories that Claire's name triggers in Irene is the fact that Claire had disappeared. Claire had had a difficult life, not extraordinarily difficult or not any more difficult than that of others in their shared neighborhood. But after Bob Kendry passed away, it was well known that Claire had had a difficult life, who was picked up by different sets of aunts who, it must be noted, were white and who did not take kindly to the child of the one black family member. And therefore, when Claire was picked up and allowed to live with different white aunts of hers, she was also expected to pick up more than her fair share of the domestic labor. All this was known, but also the story of Claire had ended abruptly at one point because it seemed to everyone in Irene's family and neighborhood that Claire simply disappeared. And after Claire's disappearance, Irene remembered that there were rumors. There were rumors that Claire had been seen in specific localities. These were quite glamorous and quite fashionable localities, and Claire was often rumored to be spending time with white people, and also once seen with a white man riding in a carriage, dining in an expensive restaurant, and wearing expensive clothes. These were rumors which Irene, as a teenage girl, had heard with quite a great deal of excitement, but also with some degree of contempt. Because in addition to hearing how these stories might have come true, there was also speculation of what Claire had done or what Claire might have done if indeed these stories were true, and if someone matching Claire's description was indeed seen in these situations. Irene realizes that she had given in to some of those malicious speculations, had partaken in some of those malicious gossip and rumor mongering, and it silences her. It prevents Irene from asking direct, forthright questions from Claire because the conversation between these two individuals becomes very one sided because they catch up or they're supposed to be exchanging stories, but it's a one sided exchange because Claire is the only one who seems to be asking questions, and Irene merely tells things about herself. They try to fill up the gap of the 12 years that have passed between the last time they saw each other. But Irene is constantly held back by this guilt. And there's a moment in which declares to Irene the reason why she didn't reach out or she didn't make any contact. And she says that the reason she did not want to meet Irene even once, or she decided not to meet Irene before disappearing, was she feared that Irene, too, like all the others, might have given into that malicious gossip. And that malicious gossip was essentially something to do with the nature of passing, but because it also had to do with the kind of personality that Claire had, and it was also associated with the questions of gender and a clear rise in the economic and social standing of Claire Kendry, that the nature of the gossip and the nature of the rumor mongering took on an especially malicious tone. And it was partly to get away from that toxic space that Claire Kendry had disappeared. And in this moment, she reveals her fear to Irene that she really wanted to not know. She wanted to preserve in her own imagination the idea that Irene Redfield would not take part in those rumors, that Irene Redfield would continue to hold on to a somewhat purer, more innocent, more sincere understanding of who Claire was. And this produces a very strange reaction. It embarrasses Irene, it shakes her, and it marks an important turning point in the relationship between these two individuals. I'll stop here to wrap up the discussion of this novel in the next lecture, but I just want to mention how powerfully the elements of romance and how powerfully the narrative structures, the recollections from memory, separation at childhood, long lost individuals reconnecting despite the challenges, despite the deprivations and the discriminations of race and society. These tropes are all present very powerfully in this novel, which on the surface seems to be about racial passing, but is in fact quite powerfully about many other things. Thank you.